using language that we hope is very simple so that parents can understand it. Special education is part of federal law. It is complicated. And so by talking about it in ways that everyone can understand, it just helps us all to be on the same page. We're going to talk a little bit about the differences between special education eligibility and a medical diagnostic evaluation. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how we can actively support families to be involved in this. And if you are a family, how you can be actively involved in this process. And so we're just going to start with what is special education. And I think even though this seems like a really simple question to answer, we found it's not. Actually, oftentimes people think of special education as a place. It's a place we send children who need extra support at school. But special education is not a place. It's actually a group of services. And so the term special education is in the federal law, and it is very broad. It is not a single thing. And it is used to describe any specially designed instruction that a child would need if they're eligible for special education. And special education is designed to support children to access their curriculum. And so this is hard for some families because there are limitations to special education. It is not designed to treat a child's disability. It is designed to provide them support so that they can access and make progress at school. And so, as I said earlier, it's not a place. It happens in public schools, and we'll talk about that in just a second. And it's designed to specifically support a child's identified educational needs. And so special education isn't designed to address a specific eligibility. And so we wouldn't say, oh, here's the supports and services you get because you have autism, or you have ADHD, or you have an intellectual disability, or you have a learning disability. They are very specialized to the unique needs of each child. And so who gets special education? And again, this isn't a simple black and white answer. It is designed for children ages 3 to 22. And so the day they turn 3 to the day they turn 22. But to be eligible for services, there's two things we have to look at. One is that a student needs to meet criteria for one of the 13 eligibilities. And I've got those 13 eligibility categories right here. And then the second is that whatever disability the child has, it has to be of the severity that they need special education services to benefit from general education. So we're going to go back to that first part. This students meet eligibility for one of the criterias. And one of the first things that's really confusing about special education is that what you see here, these 13 eligibility categories are exactly that. They're categories. They are not specific diagnostic labels. And so even though some of them have the exact same name as a diagnostic label, for example, autism, intellectual disability, specific learning disability, these are defined by IDEA, the Individual with Disabilities Education Act. It's defined by federal law. Whereas when we're looking at diagnoses, we are using different tools to define those. And we will talk about that in a second. But these are very broad categories. And your category that you fall under is not directly related to what you get or what you need. And so we'll talk more about that in just a second. So the first part is that your child needs to meet one of these criteria. And the second is that whatever needs they have are significant enough that they need special education. The premise being that it is very possible to have a disability, but not need special education to do well and progress at school. And so what does special education provide? And so there is a term, an acronym that we use called a free and appropriate public education. That is what the law says school districts have to provide. We call it FAPE for short, and you'll hear both parents and school teams call it FAPE, but it stands for free and appropriate public education. And this is what the federal law mandates school districts need to provide to children who have a disability. So let's break that down a little bit. free means it's free. So that if that child does need special education services, there's no charge to the parent. And that can be for this, specialized instruction. It can be for, supplies or tools that they need at school. It can be for their speech and language supports, or it can be for their transportation, whatever service and support that is in a child's IEP that they need to access and make progress at school is going to be provided for free. The appropriate piece is where there's probably the most discussion between families and schools. And so what appropriate means is that the services that the child receives must be directly designed to meet their educational needs. And we're going to talk more about what that actually means, but also that they make adequate progress in their setting. And so when we talk about school districts can provide all these different services, but it's not like going to the grocery store where you can pick and choose. I want some of this, some of that, some of this. Whatever services are provided have to be directly linked to what the child needs, okay? And then they have to be designed so that the child's going to make progress in the setting that they're in. So that's what appropriate means. As I said, there's a lot of discussion typically about what that means. Public education means basically that it has to happen in the public schools. Private schools do not have to follow IDEA. They can provide some supports to students, but by no reason do they need to follow special education law. And so what that means is that if you want your child to receive these services, they need to be enrolled in a public school. Every child, regardless of where they're enrolled, has a right to have an evaluation for services conducted. But typically if a school district or a team says, okay, we think your child does need services, here's what we think they need, a child's going to have to be enrolled in the public schools to get those services. And so how do schools do this? How do they provide a free and appropriate public education to every single child who has an eligible disability? And they do that through the child's individualized education program or plan, IEP. Again, we love acronyms in the schools. And so an IEP is a blueprint for a child's special education services at school. They are individualized. That's why they're called an individualized education program or plan. And in this IEP document, it's going to talk about the child's strengths and their weaknesses. So what they can do and what they cannot yet do. It's going to identify what their educational needs are. So do they have needs in reading? Do they have needs in social skills? Do they have needs in fine motor development, in social emotional coping skills, things like that? It's going to identify their needs, and then it's going to talk about the goals that are being written to address those needs, and then the services and supports that the child needs so they can meet those goals. And then IEPs, as I said, are very individualized because they're designed to meet a child's specific educational needs. They are not designed to address a specific eligibility or diagnosis. And so where does special education take place? And so, as I said earlier, it's not a place we send children, it's a group of services. And so we have another acronym that we use. It's called LRE, or Least Restrictive Environment. And so what this means is that when a child has an IEP and they're receiving special education services, it needs to happen in the least restrictive environment, meaning children with a disability need to be educated with non-disabled peers as much as possible. And so oftentimes people think of a least restrictive environment as always general education, but it's not the case. The least restrictive environment is truly an individualized concept. It is the educational setting where the child can receive all the supports and services they need, but also be with their non-disabled peers as much as possible. Okay? And so what school districts do then is that to meet that mandate, they need to offer a continuum of placements. And so that means that school districts can't just say, okay, you're in general education, or here's our one special class that we have. They have lots of different types of programming so that they can do an individualized placement for a child. And so sometimes that's general education. A very large percentage of children who have IEPs, they get their services within a general education and general education placement. So some of those kids may get specialized academic instruction. We used to call that RSP. They may get additional support in reading or writing or math. They may get speech and language. They may get counseling, but their placement is a general education classroom. So they might either be pulled out of their classroom for a portion of their day to get these services, or oftentimes somebody pushes into their classroom during the day to provide their services in that classroom. Okay. We also have collaborative or co-taught classrooms or special day classes. Collaborative and co-taught classrooms are often a blend of general education and special education students. And then special day classes are typically smaller environments where all of the students have an IEP. There's a variety of different kinds of special day classes. We have ones that are what we would say are non-categorical. They might be called mild and moderate or moderate to severe. But there are also some that are more autism specific, or ones that are specifically designed to address behavior, or maybe specifically designed to address or to support children who are visually impaired. So there is a wide variety of special day classes that school districts offer. And then if a child's needs cannot be met in what we would consider a more traditional school setting, school districts also have the ability to provide non-public school settings or residential settings. Non-public school settings are not private schools. They are private in that they're not funded by the federal government, but they are typically designed for children who have intensive social, emotional, behavioral, academic needs. And oftentimes they are funded through school districts who pay to have their children placed there. Non-public schools are designed really, we look at non-public settings and even residential settings when we feel like the school district does not have the services, supports, or ability to provide the child what they need. They need a much more intensive program. Okay, so how are these decisions made? Who decides eligibility? Who decides what the educational needs are? Who decides what appropriate services are going to be? And so in special education, it is designed to have group decision making. And so there is this thing called the IEP team, Individualized Education Program Team. And so how it is written in the law is that this is supposed to be a very collaborative decision-making team that includes the parents and other school professionals and possibly other people as well. And that the IEP team was really designed so that everyone on the team has a different level of expertise on the child. The parent is an expert on the child at home, in the community. There's going to be people on the team who know a lot about this, maybe this child's social emotional development. Others know a lot about their communication. Others know a lot about maybe their academic skills. And so that we are sharing information, we are sharing decision-making, and then we are sharing implementation, meaning we're sharing the process of supporting the plan that we're creating. And so it was very much designed to be sort of a checks and balances and very collaborative process. I think I work with a lot of families who don't feel like this is the most collaborative process. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. And sometimes it has nothing to do with the fact that the team members are really wonderful people. It's just that sometimes it feels rushed. Sometimes parents are afraid to ask questions. They're intimidated by this process. Sometimes, they've been involved in this process for years and they feel like it seems silly to ask a question now. Maybe they should already know that. And so Even though IEP teams really were designed to be these collaborative decision-making process, I'm very aware that sometimes families don't feel like that. There are certain people who have to be on an IEP team. And so the ones here that are bolded have to be there. You need to have a parent, a general education teacher, a special education teacher, and a school representative that's familiar with both general and special ed. Sometimes that's a principal, sometimes it's a school counselor, sometimes it can be the school psychologist, it can be lots of different people on campus. They just have to have knowledge of both, sort of both systems. But there are typically going to be other people there as well. You can have people who conducted the evaluation. It can be the school psychologist, maybe speech and language therapist, maybe an occupational therapist. And then if a child's getting services already, it might be the people who are actually providing them at the school, the speech language therapist, the occupational therapist, the adaptive PE teacher, any of those things. The child, if appropriate, I am actually a big fan of having children be involved in their IEP process at a very young age. And it's not that they be there the whole time, but I think it's important for children to realize they have an IEP and why they have an IEP, and to know what goals they're working on. Even at a kindergarten, first grade level, it should be a very positive thing for them to be involved. Perhaps it's intimidating to sit around with 10 separate people, so maybe that's just a smaller group meets with that child. But once children get older, they should be more involved, and by the time they're 16, they have to be involved. And when they become 18, if they're still getting services, they actually now have their own educational rights. The other people that can be involved are anyone that has special expertise regarding the child. And that is very purposely a very broad description. It really means anybody that the family would like to have invited, or the school would like to invite. Oftentimes parents don't think to invite people to the IEP. I am a fan of having parents bring someone if they're intimidated with the process, even if it's just a friend. If maybe the child's other parent or the parent's partner can't come, it's okay to bring somebody. It's not that that person might be the most active, involved in decision-making, but it might be that they're just there to provide sort of emotional support for the family. And that is absolutely okay. Parents can ask that outside providers come. Sometimes they'll have the ABA provider come. Sometimes they'll have somebody from regional center come. So those are all people that kind of fall into that category. And so the special education process has multiple steps, and we don't really have the time today for me to sort of deep dive into each one of them, but I do want to sort of highlight some of the pieces. And so what happens first is that there is a referral for evaluation. An assessment plan is then created and signed. The child's evaluated, a meeting is held, and the eligibility is decided. If the child's eligible and IEP is written, then that IEP is implemented, progress reports are provided, and the IEP is regularly reviewed. And so on the next couple of slides, I kind of want to highlight some important parts of this process. And so a parent or a school representative can request an evaluation to see if a child's eligible for special education. If the school makes that recommendation, they say to the parent, we'd like to do this, parents have to give consent before that evaluation can be done. Parents can request an initial evaluation. They can also request further assessment. For example, if their child's already receiving services, but they think perhaps they need something different or something more, they have the right to ask that. I always tell parents to put their requests in writing, and it is not because school districts are going to ignore you if you don't put it in writing. It's because we're very busy. You are busy, the kids' teacher's busy. And so by actually putting it in writing, it starts a process of documentation, and it is just easier for everyone involved to have that process started. That's really all it is. The district then, once they have received your request, needs to follow up within 15 calendar days. And there's a few different ways they can do that. They can provide you an assessment plan. They can say no. or they can hold a meeting to talk more. I will say that districts typically do not just say no unless they have ample evidence or reasoning, because if they do say no, we don't want to evaluate your child, they have to actually go down a legal path to sort of defend that decision making. Sometimes a district will just send home an assessment plan, and I don't really like that either. I think the best outcome of a parent requesting an assessment is holding a meeting with the school and with members of the team. So parent has an opportunity to really share what their concerns are, and we make sure that an assessment plan is created that's actually addressing everyone's concerns. This assessment plan will say what areas we're going to evaluate in: academics, cognitive ability, information processing, communication, gross and fine motor skills, those sort of things. Parents should ask questions about it. If they have questions about what they're doing, they should be part of that planning process. And in the state of California, once a parent has signed that assessment plan and the district has it back, they have 60 calendar days to complete that evaluation and hold a meeting to review the results and propose an IEP if a child's eligible. The reason I say in California is because some states, those timelines are slightly different. The evaluation that a school does is called a multidisciplinary evaluation. And we will talk much more about this in the next few slides. But the goal of that evaluation is really to look at, does the child meet eligibility for special education? It is not a diagnostic evaluation. We are looking to see, does this child meet this criteria? What are these child's educational needs? And then what sort of services and supports do we think they need to address those actual needs we've identified? Draft IEPs are usually written, and I say usually, I would almost say always. Sometimes it intimidates parents that they come into a meeting and an IEP has already been drafted. But the reason that they're drafted before a meeting is because they are incredibly lengthy documents, and you would be sitting there for hours if we had to write everything from a blank document. And so drafts are truly drafts. Things can be changed, added, removed. And on most IEPs, they have a huge thing on the top or across the middle that say it's a draft. And so I know it can be a little intimidating, but parents need to know that that it's just ideas, recommendations, and that those things can be changed and adjusted. And not until a parent has actually signed an IEP does it go into effect. And so once a child has an IEP, there's systems in place to sort of find out how a child's doing. Oftentimes parents will say to me, I have no idea how my child's doing in special education. And so we'll talk about the fact they should be getting progress reports. Parents should be getting progress reports that will specifically tell them if their child's making progress toward their goals, and if they're on track to meet those goals. If for some reason the child's not on track to meet the goals, that is a perfect time to ask for a meeting to find out why. Do we need to be doing something different? Does the child need more of something? But it's a good time to be able to sort of keep that in check and say, oh, okay, let's have a meeting now. We don't need to wait to an annual IEP to discuss how the child's doing. IEPs are reviewed at least once per year. Those are called annuals. And again, it's at least one time per year. Sometimes a child will have more than one IEP meeting in the year. Parents should never feel like they have to wait a year or 6 months until the child's annual before they have an opportunity to communicate with the team. There's lots of other ways to communicate with the team. Parents have a right to request an IEP at any time. So does the school. The school can request an IEP at any time. If a parent makes a request for an IEP, it has to be held within 30 days. Sometimes I'll hear people say, oh, you need to request an emergency IEP. But in reality, there is no such thing as an emergency IEP. A school district always has 30 days to hold an IEP if a parent makes that request. But I will tell you, in my experience, if it truly is an emergency, I have seen school districts pull together IEPs almost within 24 hours. And so it's not that it doesn't happen, it's just that it's not actually a thing in the law that we have these emergency IEP meetings. IEPs can be revised. They can be revised at one of a requested meeting. They can be revised throughout the year. They're called addendums. We do not need to write a whole new IEP. We can just add a page to the front saying what we've changed. So maybe we need to adjust a child services, or maybe we need to add a goal or remove a goal. That can be done very simply through an addendum. Every 3 years, a child is reevaluated for special education need and eligibility. And that is called a triennial. We oftentimes just call it a tri. And really the purpose is to see, are they still eligible? Do they still have a need for services? And even though this is at least every 3 years, sometimes we'll do a triennial early. Parents can request that it be done early. School districts sometimes request that it be done early. So there's a lot of systems in place for a family to know how their child's doing and to receive feedback. And I mean, I really do encourage families to directly talk to their teams about what's a good way for me to communicate with you. Can we do email? Oftentimes schools have, they'll have Canvas, or they'll have School Loop, or they'll have a system in place. Those can be really overwhelming and confusing for families, but there's typically someone at the school site who can help the family learn how to do it. And so again, I encourage families to sort of reach out to the school for help with that. And so I oftentimes have parents ask, my pediatrician or whomever, my neurologist, my developmental behavioral pediatrician diagnosed my child with this, with autism, with ADHD. Are they eligible for special education? And the answer to that is maybe, but the answer is not a definite yes. And so that is sometimes frustrating for families, because perhaps it's been a lengthy process for them to get a diagnosis, and now to get additional support at school, it's a whole nother process. But I'm hoping that by the next few slides, you understand sort of the differences. Not so much in what schools provide, but also how their systems are different and how they identify and talk about evaluations differently. And so a special education eligibility at school, the point of that evaluation is to determine, does the child meet the eligibility, and do they need special education services? We use IDEA criteria, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And so again, as I mentioned earlier, those criteria are slightly different, sometimes quite a bit different than diagnostic criteria that we might use in a clinical or medical setting. When a child goes in for an evaluation for a clinical diagnosis or a medical diagnosis, the whole point of that evaluation is actually to determine that diagnosis. And so the reason that is because from that diagnosis, we want to develop a treatment plan that's going to focus on home, community, maybe educational environment. And we use DSM-5 criteria. A medical or clinical diagnosis based on DSM-5 is relevant, and it can be very important, but it's not sufficient to qualify a child for special education. And the main reason is because that evaluation and diagnosis doesn't provide the school district with the information they would need to make an eligibility decision and design an IEP. That is the whole point of an educational or special education eligibility evaluation, is to gather that data. And I think one of the reasons that, again, it's so confusing for many people, and I don't mean just families, medical providers, school personnel, is that truly understanding that a diagnostic evaluation and a special education evaluation, even though we're calling them both evaluations, they have very different purposes. In a diagnostic evaluation, so that would happen at maybe a clinical setting, a medical setting, we do an evaluation. Based on those results, we get a diagnosis, and then we decide treatment. And so a very simple example would be, is if my daughter feels horrible, her throat really hurts, and she has a fever. So I take her into her pediatrician. The pediatrician does an evaluation. She looks at her throat. She asks her some questions. She takes her temperature. She does a strep test. The evaluation result comes back as, your daughter has strep throat. Her diagnosis is strep throat. Therefore, her treatment is going to be this antibiotic. That's a medical model, and we're very comfortable with that. We understand that process. In a medical clinical setting, it is the same way with a behaviorally based diagnosis like ADHD or autism. An evaluation is completed that may include observations, developmental history, parent interviews, maybe some testing or rating scales. The diagnosis is autism. 99% of the time, that diagnosis is going to lead to a treatment plan that says this child needs ABA, speech language, maybe OT. Then the family has to take that diagnosis. They are referred to these other agencies. Those other agencies do an evaluation and then come back and say, okay, we think your child needs these services to address these issues in ABA, these services to address speech and language issues, that sort of thing. But in that world and system, that diagnosis is vitally important because it dictates treatment. And in many, many insurances, you can't get that treatment without that diagnosis. School districts, school systems do not work that way. And so it is very important that we help families understand this, that in a special education system, when you go in for a special education evaluation, the first thing is done, we have an evaluation, it's completed. We review those results, the team does, and then we decide if a child's eligible for services. If they are eligible for services, we then say, okay, great, they're eligible. That eligibility is sort of put to the side. We come back and we talk about that evaluation results again. From that, we identify a child's educational needs. The educational needs in a child's IEP are by far the most important thing because those educational needs drive everything. Whereas in a medical setting, your diagnosis drives your treatment. In an educational setting, your educational needs drive what you get. Because from those needs, we write goals. Once all the goals are written, then we decide what services and accommodations you may need to meet those goals. And then we talk about what is the most appropriate placement so that you can receive all those services to meet your goals that are addressing your educational needs. And so what's important to understand is that eligibility, it gets you into special education. It does not drive what you get. That's actually sort of illegal in a special education system. So that means you could have children who all have an eligibility of autism, but their IEPs may look very, very different because they have different educational needs. But you might have a child who has an eligibility of specific learning disability, a child who has an eligibility of other health impaired, a child who has an eligibility of autism, a child has an eligibility of speech language impairment. If they have similar educational needs, then their IEPs will look more similar. And so I know it's hard not to focus on that eligibility because sometimes parents are really concerned or upset if their diagnosis doesn't match their eligibility. But what the most important thing is in this process of figuring out an IEP is making sure that the child's educational needs have been appropriately identified. Okay, why do I think it's so important that we understand this? It's because evaluations from different agencies will lead to different services. A special education evaluation can lead to special education eligibility and school-based services. Those are educationally relevant services and they are focused on educational need. But a medical clinical evaluation can lead to a diagnosis that can lead to private services, private speech, ABA, OT, and many times our kids need both. And so that's why it's important, like, to understand the differences between the evaluations, not choose, is it one or the other? Oftentimes it's getting both. And I realize that can be a confusing process and a time-consuming process, but it can often lead to a child accessing more appropriate services at school and at home. And so I want to just quickly go over some ideas on how parents, professionals, and school support people can be more involved in the process. And I'm not going to go through every one of these because I know you guys have access to these slides and you can read them after. But with parents, I feel like it's super important from the very beginning when you're requesting any kind of assessment or you're talking about assessment planning is that you share your specific concerns. What do you see at home? How do you think that is impacting them at school? How does your child talk about school at home? How much support do they need to do homework and those sort of things? During the assessment, share information early. Do you have outside assessments or diagnoses? Many times parents will tell me they want to look at the school's eval as sort of a second opinion, but remember they're very, very different purposes. So it's not a second opinion. And so if you have outside information, share it with the school. More information is better for both sides. Sign release forms. If you want them to speak to outside providers, you want them to speak to your ABA provider, then work with them to get release forms signed. Oftentimes parents are sent home a lot of different rating scales, checklists, questionnaires. They can be overwhelming. It is absolutely okay to ask for help. Call back and say, this was a ton. Can you explain what I'm supposed to do here? And then just honestly answer those based on the experience you have with your child. Even though it can be anxiety provoking, try to keep a neutral, positive attitude when you're talking about this process. Children can really pick up, like if parents are very anxious about this process, and then it can make them much more anxious about the process as well. Before the meeting, I'm all for parents just having all their information with them. I'm kind of old school, and I know a lot of people keep things on the computer, but I think it can be very powerful to walk in with a binder that has, so that you have all your information about your child in one place. You can flip back and look at prior IEPs, prior assessments, it's all right there. Ask about the IEP meeting beforehand. What are we going to do? Who's going to be there? Oftentimes, you will get an invitation, but sometimes, again, those invitations are sometimes not the most user-friendly. So clarify, what are we going to be doing there? If you have questions, write them down before the meeting. Do not just think you're going to be able to remember them as a parent. It can be an overwhelming time, and so try to think and write down any questions you have and bring them with you. Ask for copies of assessment reports to review before the IEP meeting. I have strong opinions about that. I feel like if parents truly are going to be meaningfully involved in the meeting, they need to have information prior to that meeting. So ask for those. You can ask questions, all those sort of things. Before an annual or triennial, it's the same thing, but just again, reviewing your child's past IEP documents, taking the time to think about what areas of growth have I seen? What do I think my kid's strengths are? Are there still areas that have had minimal growth? That sort of thing. During the meeting, a lot of parents, again, feel very intimidated, no matter how wonderful and kind the IEP team members are. And so just remembering you're a vital part of the team, your opinions, your questions, your concerns are all equally important. And so kind of building up your confidence to ask them. But we also have to be open-minded because everyone's input is valid. And sometimes it's hard to hear different opinions about children. And so maybe your child's behavior is very different in a certain class. And so being open-minded to hear input from other school professionals can be hard, but it's important. After the meeting, signing the IEP, if you haven't signed it, it's okay to take it home to review it, but then make a decision. If you still have questions, you can absolutely ask to have another meeting. For clinical and medical professionals, really before a child has services, it's understanding the difference between a diagnosis and an eligibility, sharing information with a family about school-based services and special education. Some families do not have a positive idea of what special education is or can be. Maybe that's based on past experiences or what their view of this was when they were growing up. But support them in requesting a meeting with their school or an evaluation. And then share your concerns. What specifically are you worried about? Sign a release form if it's given to you. Where everyone's on a timeline. So if you do get a release form, try to communicate with the school district. And then after a child's got services, there'll never be a time for a pediatrician or most clinical providers to sit down and go through an entire IEP with their family. But you can ask them, how is it going? Do you have concerns? Encourage the parent to communicate directly with the school or maybe to ask for an IEP meeting and then share resources with them. And with school professionals, I really think we need to do a better job communicating how this process works from the very beginning and not just once. I've worked with families who are incredibly educated, and even in high school, they are confused by this process, and their child's been receiving special education services since they were 3. Oops, sorry, that was my timer to keep myself on track. And so during this referral process, explaining the whole special education process to parents, explaining the purpose of the evaluation to them, explaining their role in the evaluation and what each person will be doing. During the evaluation process, keeping parents involved and aware of what's going on. Something I really learned a lot about, transitioning from a school district to more of a clinical setting, is how involved parents are when a child's being evaluated within a clinical setting, mostly because they're bringing them and dropping them off, picking them up for appointments. So there's time to check in. But I look back at my experience as a school psychologist and realize there were times where I talked to the parent right when the evaluation started, and then I didn't really talk to them again to the very end. And I don't think that's great. I think that was sort of what I was used to doing. But now I realize how important it is to keep parents very involved in this process. It doesn't mean you have to communicate with them every day, but it does mean letting them know what's going on. Letting them know, oh, I'm going to maybe do this with your child this week, or the speech and language therapist has finished up their testing with the child, that sort of thing. That is incredibly powerful for a parent to not feel like this whole process is so intimidating and they don't know what's happening. Even though it is such a comfortable process to us, it's not to parents. It is such a sort of a unique experience for them. Before the meeting, providing families with the information they need so that they can be meaningfully involved in the IEP meeting. IDEA could not be more clear that parents need to be active participants and meaningfully involved. And the only way they can do that is if they completely understand the purpose and format of the meeting. And just sending home an invitation is not enough. A 5-minute phone call can make all the difference of explaining, here's what's going to happen, here's going to be here, who's going to be there, here's your role, and then providing them the information they're going to need. I feel strongly parents should have a right to review any draft reports and have an opportunity to ask questions about them. I know that is not always the norm, but if we stop and think about the fact that we're expecting a family to come in, listen to a report that sometimes is 40 to 60 pages long, process all that, and then be actively involved in the IEP meeting, there's really no way for them to do that without having that information beforehand. And then after the meeting, following up with parents to see, do you have any questions or concerns, even if they signed the IEP already. Letting them be aware of the process. You're going to be getting these progress reports, annual reviews. If you have questions or concerns, you can just reach out to me directly. The one thing in the position I've learned is that more is more here. Like parents, it's a confusing process. Parents sometimes need to hear things multiple times, before they really do understand it. Meaning just reading their parent rights one time doesn't mean they're expert on them. Having you tell them one time when they signed an assessment plan what's going to happen doesn't mean that that's going to be what they remember. Special education is, I tease my students, it is a wonky process. And so sort of accepting that, embracing that, but like helping families understand that, helping outside providers understand that can go really far to building a much more collaborative relationship with them. And so I've got some resources here, and I am more than happy to answer any questions for the rest of the time that we have.
Awesome. And then as a friendly reminder, Dr. Carrier will be sharing her slides. And so I'll put those on the Padlet so that you can click on any of these links that might be helpful to your family. If you do have any questions, you can feel free to type them into the Q&A. It should be at the bottom of your screen. It says Q&A. But in the meantime, I will ask some questions that I feel like are very common. One of them I feel like we get a lot as providers or just in general working with families is what if the school district and myself find very different areas of need, particularly with social skills or pragmatic language. how can I support or better advocate for my child if I believe that is an area of need that the school's not recognizing?
A really complicated question. Okay, and so, but I'm going to simplify it to what if I feel like my kid has more educational need or different educational needs than the district is seeing? And so I think what often happens is parents think they need more. My kid needs more. Districts don't respond to my child needs more very well. They respond much better to I feel like my child has unmet educational needs. And so I think what parents need to do is you do not need to be an expert in special education, but you can just share, here's my concerns. For example, you were saying that they don't have any academic needs, but homework takes us about 4 hours, and my child typically cries 3 times and I cry 1 time. And there's no way that if I wasn't with them, they wouldn't. Like, so sharing that experience. If we have like concerns that my child social pragmatic language, maybe they did very well on like a test, but like they're not using those skills. They're struggling, they don't have friends, or they have a lot of drama with their friends. They are struggling at the playground, they don't know what to do. So you sharing what your concerns are and asking that your child's not just evaluated based on tests, because sometimes we have kids who know exactly what they should be doing and can tell someone that, but they don't actually generalize those skills. But asking them to be like, to have their functional skills evaluated. And so what does my child actually look like in the playground? When they're interacting with others? What does my child actually look like in the classroom when the teacher says, okay, everybody get together in groups of 3 or 4 to do this next activity? Those sort of things. And so I feel like it's just parents need to feel confident, or at least comfortable saying, here are the things that I see. And then if the school is saying, no, we don't see that, it's fine. You need to ask for evidence of that, data of that. What does that look like? And oftentimes it might be just test scores, but that's not enough. You really need to know, what does my child look like out in the different social environments that they're at school?
Awesome. Okay, for timing, I'm going to go ahead and move into the polls. Thank you so much for your presentation. As always, that was fabulous and super helpful. We do have, it looks like, one more question, but I do want to launch the poll. So would it be okay if I launch the poll and you kind of answer the question?
Absolutely, and I will happily ask that.
Okay. So the question is, my son's special education teacher is pushing for more time in the general education class because it's almost becoming detrimental to pull him out to the special education class, which he loves. Is it wrong for me to refuse and keep his time split if I feel he's not ready socially?
And so it would be, that's a great question. And so I feel like a lot of those, I would want to know information about what the goal is to push him into the general education class. I have a bias, and a strong bias, to be very honest, toward inclusion, because I feel like when children are in that general education classroom, they are getting really good social role models, language role models, behavioral role models, and access to what the curriculum actually is. That does not mean that a child just gets thrown in there without support, though. And so I would want to know, why do you think they're ready to do this? Does it have to be, can it be that we're moving, a little bit more slowly? Even though he loves the special education class, and I would want to know, what is it that he loves? Is it the teacher? Is it that he's got some friends in there? And so how can we take that and sort of, take some of that support and put it with him in his general class? And then when you're saying he's not ready socially, I would want to know more about, like, what does that mean? Are you concerned about self-advocacy? Are you concerned about just having to be in a room with 25 or 30 kids. And so, I mean, I feel like a lot of discussion needs to still happen here. And, you know, again, you identifying exactly why the teacher thinks she wants to see him sort of in this setting more often. And then if you agree that, like, okay, I see that it would be beneficial, what supports go with him? Because it shouldn't just be, I'm in a special education classroom or I'm in general education with nothing. Like, there needs to be a sort of a transition where support goes with him to make sure he's being successful.
Okay, thank you so much. We really appreciated, again, her slides and this recorded presentation.